The wind howled through the dusty streets of Calder Hollow, whipping the sand into swirling clouds that seemed to choke the very life out of the town. It was a forgotten place, a speck on the map, where people came when they had nowhere else to go, when they wanted to disappear, to leave the world behind. The earth here was unforgiving, just like the people. Everything about this place was harsh, weathered, and worn thin. And yet, Martha Green had learned to live with it. There was no other choice but to endure. 2 years had passed since the accident that took Daniel from her. The mining accident, one of many in this godforsaken town, had claimed his life in an instant. He was the world to her, the warmth in the cold, the one person who had made this bleak place feel like home. But now, he was gone, and all she had left was silence, broken only by the steady hum of her sewing machine. She worked to keep her hands busy, to keep the pain at bay. But no matter how much fabric she stitched, it couldn't mend the hole in her heart. There were no children, no family to surround her, just the lonely streets and the distant mountains, a world she no longer recognized. Martha sat at the small wooden table in her cabin, her fingers moving skillfully as she repaired a torn shirt for a neighbor. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast long shadows across the room, making the walls feel even more confining. Every now and then, her gaze drifted to the tiny window, where she could see the deserted streets of the town. It was a place she had never truly felt a part of, a place that felt more like a memory than a reality. The town was dying, just like everything else in this desolate land. There was a certain emptiness to the air in Calder Hollow, an absence that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone who stayed too long. No one came here by choice. Everyone who remained had been forced into it by circumstance, by a life they couldn't outrun. And yet, Martha had made her peace with it, or so she told herself. But every time she looked out at the barren landscape, she couldn't help but wonder if it was even possible to make peace with something so hollow. The hours slipped by in quiet solitude. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric, a rhythmic dance that was as familiar to her now as breathing. She was numb to the passage of time. How long had it been since Daniel's death? The days blurred together. The seasons changed, but nothing ever felt different. Nothing ever felt like it mattered. From the window, she watched the street as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a soft, golden glow over the crumbling buildings. The market was empty, the saloon was silent, and the old hotel stood like a forgotten relic of a time when people still believed in this place. The town was slowly disappearing, like everything else here. And all Martha had were memories, fragments of a life that seemed so distant now. But as she sat there, stitching away in the quiet of her cabin, she realized something. There was still a small flicker of hope inside her, a tiny spark that refused to be snuffed out, even in the darkest of moments. She didn't know what that hope was for, or whether it was foolish to keep it alive, but it was there, and as long as it was, she would keep moving forward, even if it was just one stitch at a time. The morning was still and quiet, with only the soft rustling of the wind through the dry grass. Then, from the distant horizon, a rider appeared. A man on horseback, cutting through the misty morning like a shadow. He was tall, with a strong, commanding presence, but there was something about him that spoke of hardship, of a life lived on the edge, beyond the comfort of civilization. His horse kicked up clouds of dust as it moved steadily toward Calder Hollow, and for a moment, it seemed as though the very earth trembled beneath his feet. Martha Green stood on her porch, her hand resting on the worn wood of the railing, watching as the figure approached. She had seen many strangers over the years, drifters, bounty hunters, thieves, but something about this man stirred a feeling in her, a knot in her stomach that she couldn't shake. There was an air of mystery surrounding him, something hidden beneath the surface, a quiet danger in the way he carried himself. It made her uneasy, though she couldn't quite place why. As the man drew closer, his silhouette became clearer. He was dressed in worn leather, his face weathered by the sun and wind, with eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. His hat was low, casting a shadow over his face, but she could see enough to know that he wasn't the sort of person who would settle in a place like Calder Hollow. Still, who was really? He slowed his horse as he reached the foot of her porch, tipping his hat as he dismounted with an easy grace. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice low and smooth, but carrying a quiet authority. "I'm Jack Thompson. I've come to find work." I hear there's a blacksmith in town." Martha didn't respond immediately. She stood still, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. There was something about him, something in the way he moved, the way his eyes flickered with a hidden knowledge, that made her wary. She had learned long ago that not all smiles were meant to be trusted. Not all strangers were just that. Some carried more than just a past. They carried shadows. After a long, drawn-out pause, she gestured vaguely down the road. "The blacksmith's just down there," she said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of coolness in her tone. "You'll find him." Jack nodded, tipping his hat in acknowledgement. "Thank you, ma'am." But before he could turn and walk away, he paused, as if hesitating, then turned back to her. There was something uncertain in his movements, a flicker of vulnerability that contradicted his otherwise solid, unshakable appearance. "Ma'am," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "Would you happen to have a place where I could stay for the night? Somewhere simple, nothing fancy, just somewhere out of the wind." Martha hesitated, the instinct to say no rising in her. She was a woman used to her privacy, used to the solitude of the quiet town. The thought of inviting a stranger into her space felt like a breach, a crack in the fragile walls she'd built. Yet, there was something about him, something that suggested he didn't belong here, but perhaps had nowhere else to go. The town wasn't exactly brimming with accommodations. Most people who passed through didn't stay long, and there weren't many places to rent. She looked at him for a moment longer, then sighed inwardly. She knew what she had to do, even if it didn't sit right with her. "You can stay in the barn," she said, finally relenting. "It's clean enough. I keep my sewing stuff in there." Jack's face softened with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "I appreciate it." He turned and headed toward the barn, but Martha couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in her chest. There was something about the way he walked, his broad shoulders squared, his gait firm and purposeful, that spoke of a man who had seen things, who had been through battles both within and outside of himself. It wasn't just the dust or the roughness of his appearance. There was a tension in his movements, a readiness in his step, as if he were always prepared for something more, something unknown. As Jack disappeared into the barn, Martha found herself staring after him. She could feel the weight of his presence lingering in the air around her, and though she told herself it was just the unfamiliarity of the moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a story behind those eyes, something untold, something darker. And in that moment, she realized she couldn't ignore the truth. Jack Thompson had come to Calder Hollow for more than just work. He had come to escape, or perhaps to find something. But whether he would find it here, or whether it would find him, remained to be seen. As the days stretched into weeks, Jack Thompson quietly settled into life in Calder Hollow. His presence, though subtle, became a fixture of the town. He worked at the blacksmith's shop, his hands moving with a skill that earned him quiet respect. He never sought attention, never sought to stand out. His way was one of solitude, always keeping to himself, speaking only when necessary, his past wrapped in a veil of silence that nobody dared to uncover. His actions, however, spoke louder than any words could, and Martha found herself noticing him more than she would have liked. She watched him in passing, at first unnoticed by him. She noticed the way he helped the elderly storekeeper with her heavy bags of grain without a second thought, how he offered a quiet, kind word to the children who ran through the streets. Jack Thompson was a man of few words, yet there was an undeniable strength in him that pulled at Martha's attention. His quiet acts of kindness, the way he held himself in even the most mundane situations, left a mark on her. But it was not just his actions that caught her eye. It was the way he carried himself. His broad shoulders, his steady gaze, the air of someone who had lived through more than his fair share of hardships. There was a tension in his posture, a readiness in his every step, as though he were always preparing for something unknown. Martha, though used to the solitude of her life, found herself drawn to the mystery that clung to him. She told herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. But deep down, she knew that there was something more, something beneath the surface that she couldn't ignore. Then, one evening, the atmosphere in the town changed. Martha was walking to the market, the streets quieter than usual as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the dirt roads. She had only a few errands to run, and she had learned to enjoy these rare moments of peace when the town seemed to be holding its breath. But peace would not last. As she neared the saloon, a group of rowdy men stepped into her path. They were drunk, their eyes bloodshot and lewd, their laughter echoing in the still air. They blocked her way, their glares full of ill intent. Martha's heart began to race, a familiar chill creeping up her spine. There was no one else on the street, no one who could help her. She stepped back instinctively, but the men took a step forward, their smirks growing wider. "You look lost, sweetheart," one of them sneered, his breath reeking of whiskey. The others chuckled darkly. Martha's pulse quickened, and she instinctively looked around for any sign of help. That's when she saw him, Jack Thompson. He appeared from the shadows, moving toward her with a quiet, purposeful stride, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. He didn't say a word as he closed the distance between them. His presence was commanding, and the men froze, as if sensing something in him that they didn't quite understand. Jack stepped in front of Martha, his body a solid wall between her and the rowdy men. "Gentlemen," Jack's voice was low, his tone colder than the evening air. "You might want to back off." His eyes never left the men, his gaze steady, unwavering. The leader of the group, a man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered and stepped forward. "And what if we don't?" he growled, his hand moving to his waist, where a knife glinted menacingly in the fading light. Jack's eyes narrowed, and before anyone could react, he was on him, grabbing the man by the collar, lifting him off the ground with terrifying strength, and slamming him hard into the wooden wall of the saloon. The man gasped for air, his face turning an unhealthy shade of green as Jack held him there, not an ounce of mercy in his grip. The other men hesitated, but Jack's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "I said leave. Now." Without another word, the rest of the men backed off, their faces twisted in a mix of fear and confusion. They stumbled away, muttering under their breath, but Jack never took his eyes off them until they had disappeared down the street. Only then did he release the man, who crumpled to the ground, gasping and clutching his throat. Jack turned slowly, his expression unreadable, and walked back toward Martha. She stood frozen, heart pounding, still processing what had just happened. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body still tense from the encounter. Jack didn't say anything as he passed her, but she could feel the intensity in the air between them. Martha opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. "Tish, thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack didn't stop walking, but he glanced back over his shoulder, a small, fleeting smile crossing his face. It was the first time she had seen any trace of warmth in him. "No need to thank me," he said softly, almost to himself. "It's just what I do." And with that, he disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Martha standing there, her heart still racing, her thoughts in a whirl. The night seemed quieter now, but somehow, Martha knew it wasn't just the absence of the men. It was the way Jack had made her feel, safe, yet unsettled, as though there was more to him than she could ever fully understand. Something about him pulled her in, and she didn't know if it was his strength or his mystery, but she found herself wanting to know more. Over time, Martha and Jack spent many hours together, the rhythm of their daily lives weaving an unspoken connection between them. They worked side by side, exchanged quiet pleasantries, and shared the rare moments of solitude that Calder Hollow offered. Yet, despite the growing bond, there was always a distance, a space between them that neither of them dared to cross. Jack, in his quiet, brooding way, kept his past locked away, and Martha, though curious, never pressed him for answers. She understood the weight of unspoken histories, the kind of weight that could break a person if it was dragged into the light too soon. Still, there were moments, fleeting but sharp, when Martha would catch a glimpse of something buried deep in Jack's eyes. A tiredness that went beyond physical exhaustion, a shadow that seemed to follow him no matter where he went. She knew there was something he wasn't telling her, something more than just the hard years of wandering that had brought him to this town. But she let it be, respecting the silence between them, believing that if he ever chose to speak, he would. Then one night, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a fiery glow over the desolate landscape, Martha and Jack sat outside her cabin by the fire. The flames danced in front of them, their crackling sound the only thing that broke the silence of the night. Jack's face was illuminated by the warm glow, but the shadows in his eyes seemed deeper than ever. For a long time, neither spoke. The quiet was comfortable, but it held a tension, a fragile peace that could be shattered by a single word. Jack was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he had been carrying this for years and now, finally, had the chance to let it out. "I wasn't always a good man," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire, his hands clenched tightly around the cup in his hands. "I made decisions I'm not proud of." Martha watched him carefully, her gaze soft and patient, waiting for him to continue. His words were heavy, laden with something that made her heart ache. She didn't press him, didn't urge him to say more. Instead, she simply sat beside him, her silence a sign that she was willing to listen, if and when he was ready. Jack fell into a long, uncomfortable silence, the kind that stretched on too long but didn't feel like it needed to be filled. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost as if the weight of his confession was choking him. "I was accused of something I didn't do," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Something that ruined me. It tore everything apart. I had to run. If I hadn't, I don't know what would have happened. I couldn't stay, not with what I was being blamed for." Martha felt her heart tighten at his words. Her breath caught in her chest as she realized that Jack's pain ran deeper than the physical scars that marked his hands. He wasn't just a man who had known hardship. He was a man haunted by something far darker, something that had forced him into a life of flight and fear. She placed a hand gently on his arm, her touch light but steady, offering him what comfort she could without words. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to," she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. "But remember, whatever it is, it doesn't change what's here." She placed her hand over her heart, her eyes locking with his, trying to convey the depth of her sincerity. Jack's eyes softened, the hard edges of his expression fading for a moment. He met her gaze, and for a heartbeat, it felt as though the weight between them lifted, if only for an instant. But then, just as quickly, his guard returned. He looked away, staring into the fire, his face tightening once more. "I'm sorry," Jack muttered, his voice rough, as if the words were hard to get out. "I just wanted you to know. I've carried it with me for so long." Martha's heart ached for him, but she didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes, and she knew that sometimes the weight of a person's past could only be understood in moments like these, moments where no words were necessary, just the presence of someone willing to stay. Jack remained silent for a long while, his eyes never leaving the fire. The flames flickered in the night, casting long shadows across his face. And in that moment, Martha realized that she wasn't just witnessing his confession. She was also witnessing the kind of vulnerability that few ever saw, and fewer still would ever understand. They sat there in the quiet of the night, each of them holding on to their thoughts, their truths. And while the past still haunted Jack in ways he could never fully escape, Martha understood that sometimes just being present was enough to heal wounds that had long since festered in the dark. The fire crackled on, and the night stretched out before them. But Martha felt the beginning of something new. A bond, fragile yet strong, had been forged in the silence. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough for both of them. The storm came without warning, a fierce and relentless beast that seemed to tear the very sky apart. The wind howled like a living thing, shrieking as it whipped through the narrow streets of Calder Hollow, rattling the old buildings that lined the roads. The rain poured down in sheets, blinding and violent, as though the heavens themselves had opened up to punish the earth below. The town, usually so quiet and still, erupted into chaos. Doors slammed shut, shutters rattled, and the sound of frantic footsteps echoed through the streets as people scrambled for cover. Martha stood at the doorway of her cabin, her heart racing as the storm raged outside. The violent winds tore at her clothes, pulling her hair from its confines, and the rain stung her face like sharp needles. She had seen storms before, but nothing like this. It felt like the world was coming apart, as if the earth itself were rebelling against the weight of the lives that walked upon it. The fury of nature was all around her, overwhelming, consuming. Suddenly, the roar of the wind was cut through by a familiar voice, shouting her name above the madness. "Martha!" Jack's voice was strained, fighting to reach her through the gale. "Get to shelter. Now!" She turned, her heart leaping in her chest as she saw him. his silhouette barely visible through the storm. Jack was moving toward her, cutting through the chaos with the same determination she had come to know in him. His face was set, his eyes locked on her with a focus that made the storm around them seem almost distant. Before she could react, a loud, terrifying crash echoed in the distance, and a massive rock, dislodged by the furious winds, came tumbling toward her. It hurtled through the air with terrifying speed, its jagged edges glinting in the rain. "Martha, move!" Jack shouted again. In a flash, he was there, his strong arms pushing her out of the way just as the rock smashed into the ground where she had been standing seconds before. The force of the impact sent a wave of debris flying, but Jack had already yanked her to her feet, pulling her toward the barn. The wind howled around them, but Jack didn't let go. He was relentless, his grip firm as he guided her through the storm. The rain soaked through their clothes, and the wind seemed to tear at them from all sides. But Jack's determination never wavered. Every step he took seemed to defy the fury of the storm, and Martha could feel the heat of his resolve even as the cold water drenched them. When they finally reached the barn, Jack slammed the door shut behind them, shutting out the worst of the storm. The sound of the wind and rain pounded against the walls, but inside, it was strangely quiet. They were safe, for now. Jack stood there, chest heaving with exertion, his eyes locked onto Martha's with an intensity that left her breathless. The storm outside raged on, but in that moment, nothing seemed to matter except the space between them. He took a step forward, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. His voice was low, full of emotion, as he spoke. "I'm not letting you go," he said, his words laced with something deeper, something raw. "Not now, not ever." Martha's heart raced, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts, but her body only knew one thing: to stay close, to let him hold her steady in the middle of the chaos. Her voice caught in her throat, but her eyes spoke what words could not. She didn't need to say anything. The storm outside could rage as fiercely as it wanted, but in that moment, she was no longer alone. She simply nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and relief. The storm had brought them together in a way nothing else could have. Through all the chaos, all the destruction, they had found each other. And in the shelter of the barn, with the wind howling and the rain pouring outside, Martha knew that they would face whatever came next, together. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of nature's fury. The winds had calmed, the rain had stopped, and the streets of Calder Hollow were slowly returning to a fragile sense of normalcy. But for Martha, the storm was far from over. In the stillness of the morning, as she stepped outside to survey the damage, her thoughts were anything but peaceful. The past few days had been a blur of chaos, confusion, and raw emotions. She had seen Jack at his most vulnerable, witnessed the darkness of his past unfold before her, felt the weight of his regrets and the shadows that haunted him. But through it all, she had also seen the strength in him, the courage to face the storm, both literally and figuratively. She had felt the depth of his heart, his desire to protect, to make things right, even when it seemed impossible. Martha stood at the edge of her porch, gazing out at the town that had been shaken to its core. The wreckage from the storm was everywhere, but there was something in the air, something hopeful. The light of a new day broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow on the town, as if the world was giving them a chance to rebuild. But rebuilding wasn't just about mending the broken town. It was about mending the broken people in it. And for Martha, that meant making a choice she had been avoiding for days. Even though she had known deep down that it was inevitable, she turned and found Jack standing in the doorway, watching her. His face was weathered, but there was something softer in his eyes now, a vulnerability that he had never allowed anyone to see before. He had been a man defined by his past, by the mistakes that had shaped him into someone hardened by fear and guilt. But in this moment, Martha saw the man he could become, if only he allowed himself to be more than the shadows of his past. "Jack," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "I don't know if I can forgive everything you've done, but I know I can't live without you." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of their shared history. Jack's expression shifted, the hardness in his eyes softening. For the first time, Martha saw the truth in him, the truth that had been buried beneath layers of self-doubt and shame. "Then stay," Jack replied simply, his voice low, filled with a resolve that only strengthened his presence. "Stay, and let me prove that I'm worth it." And just like that, the decision was made. In that moment, the choice was no longer about right or wrong, about what they had done or what had been done to them. It was about trust, about the willingness to face an uncertain future together. For all the storms that life would throw their way, they had each other. And that, Martha realized, was enough. In the days that followed, Calder Hollow slowly began to heal. The winds that had torn through the town had cleared the air, and now the town was being rebuilt, piece by piece. But for Martha and Jack, their rebuilding was just beginning. Together, they stood hand in hand, facing the unknown that lay ahead of them. The desert stretched out before them, vast and endless, a reminder of how small they were in the grand scheme of things. The wind still howled, and the world was still full of uncertainty. But with Jack by her side, Martha no longer feared the future. Love, she realized, wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about saving each other from the past or trying to fix the broken pieces. It was about choosing each other every day, in the face of all the mess and chaos life brought. And as they walked forward, side by side, Martha knew that, no matter what came next, they would face it together. They had already survived the worst of the storm. The rest was just another part of their journey. Together, they could face anything.